Hi, Dr. Keane.
Hi there.
Let's see where you are. Let's see. I have a few questions to ask you. Okay. I was wondering, you yourself, are you good with money?
No, I'm not. Being part of the generation that grew up when there were no real worries about employment stability, I've always been not particularly a saver, and I certainly didn't try to accumulate assets and watch them rise in value as I was growing up. So I didn't actually buy my first house until just before I ended up getting married, and I think at that stage was about 34, 35. And I bought it to live in, not as a place to watch rise in value.
But did it?
No, actually when I bought it was just actually the beginning of the first big bubbles in Australian real estate, because I bought it just because of the circumstances of my life. I bought it in 1988, I think, maybe in 87, 88 I think, and that was the year that our government reintroduced what they call the first home owners scheme, and I call it the first home vendors scheme, because what it does is give extra money to people buying a house, which they then take to a bank, or the bank factors into the loan they give them, and say that if they got given $7,000 by the government, which is the current level, they'd lever it up to $100,000 of borrowed money and drive up the price of the house they were bidding on by $50,000 and give much more money to the vendor, so the vendor benefits. So we had a big bubble back in 1989-90, which is the biggest house price bubble we ever had, and I bought it very near the peak of the bubble, and then met my then wife-to-be shortly after, and then sold out just on the other side of the peak. So with my renovation costs and stuff like that, I probably came out slightly below even.
Oh.
But yeah, I'm not good with managing money. I've always, I still behave like a 25-year-old in terms of how I spend. And
so you do the impulse purchases at the cash out?
No, I don't do those, but I do impulse purchases of computer software and computer gear and technology and stuff like that. You know, I've never gone out in search of a large salary. I've gone in search of what I want to learn.
Okay. Oh. Well, I wonder what the language that is.
Italian, Mama.
Oh.
I'm only guessing.
Okay. So you've benefited a lot from academics. You have like a zillion degrees. You've been in university for billions of years. and all these students now want to get educations, but it's just too expensive. Do you think that there is another way in this day and age to benefit from education as much as possible without going bankrupt?
Well, the whole problem
what do you suggest for them?
I'm against charging students fees and letting them run up student debt, because that instantly locks them into a mentality where they think all they've got to do is raise the money to pay for their education. And in fact, they put far less attention into their education than they did back in the days when I went through, when in fact it was free. Or you had to get a scholarship to get in. And they've also, I think universities have also had their numbers drastically expanded compared to this percentage of the population they used to have as an intake, largely as a way of disguising the level of youth unemployment. If you go back to the 1970s, the unemployment level in America was below 4%, in Australia it was below 1%, and on occasions often certainly below 2%. And you therefore didn't have any fear about not getting a job when you graduated, and we didn't have any debt either, so you could actually really focus on what you were there to learn. We used to have colleges of advanced education, TAFEs, technical colleges, and so on, which were actually teaching a trade education that is quite a sensible part of a well-functioning economy. Now, people will arrive and they're worried about paying off their debt as soon as they get there, so their attention isn't even on the learning, and they treat it more as a certification in a lot of ways than education.
It's a huge dent in the productivity of younger people.
Yeah, they're not learning as much, they're not learning as deeply, and they're not challenging as much either.
Yeah, I read online yesterday that Canada dropped out of the top 10 in terms of innovation.
Yeah.
Maybe that has something to do with it.
Yeah, well, I'm sure there's a whole lot of factors. I mean, we're doing less innovation now than we were 30 or 40 years ago, and it's...
Because young people are just saddled with debt.
Well, I think they're saddled with debt to begin with, so their mind isn't on what they're actually learning. Back in those days, you'd find yourself sitting around, you know, in environments like we are now, only in the middle of the university, having long philosophical raves and arguments over mathematical techniques and what's your favourite semiconductor and what's the hottest idea you've heard recently in bioengineering, etc., etc. That sort of conversation was feasible back then. Students were engaged in what they were supposed to learn, whereas now they're more engaged in paying off the education they've got, which they're seeing often more as a certification than in fact a genuine education. So I think we've definitely diminished the quality of education by saying students should be paying for it. It's putting a mindset in the student body that has been counterproductive to learning.
Okay, earlier we were walking around, you told me that you have 4 sisters.
Yeah.
What did you learn about money from them, if anything?
Well, they're all younger than me for a start.
Okay.
Literally what I learned from my mother and father, and what I learned was actually a reaction to behaviour that I didn't understand. And I now look back, it was the wrong reaction, because my parents were incredibly conservative about debt, and I had no real idea why. But now when you look back historically, they were the late Depression generation. They saw the damage done by the level of debt accumulated in the Great Depression and the impact that being in debt had on people back then. And that scarred a whole generation. They were the late members of that generation, but nonetheless that still affected them. So conservatism about debt was a social value in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. But by the time the 60s really got flying, people of my age became the dominant pop culture. And we couldn't understand our parents' conservatism. Out there, have a good time was the attitude. So the boom that was created by the low debt levels led to us not realising the dangers of being in excessive debt. And then we took off on the debt accelerator that in Australia began in the mid-60s, when I was still about a 10-year-old child.
When people are a lot more cavalier about debt as they are now compared to your parents' generation, what kind of damage have you seen in your circles or in Australia or in the world?
Well, I've seen people go bankrupt. I've seen people get caught up in speculative bubbles that they thought was them being a genius, and then on the 7th house they tried to flip, the bubble burst and they ended up bankrupt and died in a poorhouse. That's literally a case of one of my next door neighbours some years ago. So I've seen that sort of thing happen. But I've also seen a materialistic attitude take over society, because it's all about accumulating wealth as fast as possible. That attitude, that social attitude, is really what came out of the 60s and 70s. The hippies and the progressives and so on, who saw themselves as the soul of that period, were the detritus, in effect, of the wealth of the period, because you could actually afford...
The what?
Detritus.
What's a detritor?
The waste.
Okay.
The drip-offs.
Okay.
Okay. They were living off the prosperity that was being caused by the low levels of debt at the time and the high levels of innovation. And then as the Ponzi personalities took over the whole culture and the growth of the financial sector occurred, that really became what we got out of the 60s and 70s, that you could get rich by leveraging up. And so that attitude really is what shaped the 70s, 80s, 90s and where we get to now. And therefore the hippies didn't, even though we affect the popular culture from that era, they weren't the ones who dominated the nature of the world we moved into.
Well, who wants to be a millionaire?
Yeah, well, that attitude is what dominates.
Do you?
No.
Okay, so with women, there are some women in Iceland. And they have taken over parliament, and they've taken over a lot of the investment banking houses, because they feel that part of the problem is the testosterone injected, I don't know, craziness that has gone into short-term thinking, for profit, not thinking about the long-term stability of consumer portfolios. What do you have to say to them? Is the behavior of men the issue? I know your issue is with neoclassicist economists, but what about the fact of men? And you're one.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think there's a certain truth to it, because certainly testosterone encourages reckless behaviour and also gives you a sense of invincibility when you're young and you've got too much of it in your system. And it certainly goes hand in hand with the sort of behaviour I saw in finance markets. And I think it is something which is much more a male phenomenon than a female phenomenon. The trouble is when women get into the area, they tend to try to match the testosterone charged behaviour of the men. So, and when I can't think of her last name, but Abby was one of the favourite hate elements that I remember from the 90s bubble, because Abby, whatever her last name was, forever saying the markets are going to continue going up. She was feeding the same euphoria that the testosterone charged behaviour of the traders was actually causing. But I think it is true that it's something which comes down to an innate differences between men and women, that with the testosterone charge that men get, the reckless behaviour that tends to give you goes hand in hand with the sort of recklessness we saw in the financial sector.
So for all the math that you're doing and all the books that you're writing, do you think it could actually come down to women just having an easier pressure on the accelerator there? Do you think that could be a plausible angle?
On the other hand, I've seen plenty of instances where women can be as warlike as men, in the case of Maggie Thatcher.
Warlike?
Warlike.
Oh, warlike, okay.
And get as caught up and believe the same bullshit that men can believe. Because it isn't just the testosterone behaviour. I mean, you can be testosterone laden and hop into a sports car and burn around a racetrack at incredible speed and live, because this race car has been designed by bloody careful engineers who get their testosterone kicks from making sure the machine is designed to handle virtually any circumstance, and even a moron couldn't crash it. So you get that balancing set where the testosterone attitude of the driver is matched by the testosterone manufacturing engineering of the designers of the car, and the two work. The trouble in finance is that we had testosterone charged behaviour with an absolutely insane idea of how markets actually function. And putting the two together, then you had madness on, well, not on steroids, but on testosterone. Now, if you had it on estrogen, you'd still have the trouble, but you're basing your estrogen on madness. So it comes down to the mental attitudes, the ideas, rather than just the hormonal charge on top.
Okay. Thank you.